Welcome to Science at FMNH, a podcast and video series that explores the science behind the scenes at Chicago's Field Museum. For this episode, we asked collections and research staff to answer the question, what is your favorite museum specimen?
My name's John Bates, and I'm chairman of the zoology department. I'm also an associate curator of birds, and I've been here at the institution for 16 years now. My favorite specimen in the collection that I always tell people about is it's a greater bird of paradise. Great birds of paradise are these spectacular birds that live in New Guinea and a little bit in Australia, and they have incredible plumage where the males have these elaborate plumes that are designed to attract females. Well, this one greater bird of paradise specimen we have has a label on it, and the label says, "Old specimen collected by Wallace, Aru Islands." And that's about it. And somebody else wrote that on the tag. But what I like to use this specimen for is it illustrates some great things about how we learn things through collections. Alfred Russel Wallace was, along with Charles Darwin, the man who came up with the idea that natural selection was driving evolution. He was in the Aru Islands in about 1856, and we know this because he published stuff. But we actually don't know anything else about that specimen. So that's all the information we have on that specimen. But one interesting thing about it also is that the scientific name is Paradisea apoda. And apoda is Latin for without feet. And this was a bird that was described to science by Carolus Linnaeus, the guy who developed the binomial system of nomenclature in about the 1760s. And what was going on is they were sending collectors out around the world who were preparing specimens, sending them back. Linnaeus was looking at them and describing them. Well, the people who must have collected this first Paradisea apoda, this greater bird of paradise, collected this specimen and sent it back in a box with no legs on the specimen. So Linnaeus opened this box, saw this spectacular bird. It had no legs, and he described it to science as never landing. And it took about 50 to 60 years before somebody got back to the range of this bird and realized that it's just like any other perching bird, it has regular feet. But I like to use that as a great example of how important really good data are with specimens. And one of the things that we strive for today is getting as much information as we can on a specimen. So today, in addition to collecting a specimen that actually has legs on it, so that we would know that it had legs, we collect all kinds of information like tissue, we collect parasites, we collect stomach contents. We do a tremendous amount of data collecting so that each one of those specimens has as much information associated with it as we can possibly get.
My name's Danielle Ruby. I'm a research assistant in the anthropology department at the Field Museum of Natural History. My favorite specimen of all time is so stereotypical for the archaeologist. When I was in the Gobi Desert, we found the first piece of gold for the region that we were excavating in Mongolia. The region was Bagagazernchulu, and it was a gold earring that we found in this female grave, and she was laid in a coffin, and we also found 2 sets of prenatal bones. So she was either pregnant with twins or she had just delivered twins. We aged them to about 7 months. We know that she was close to full term when she died or was killed. And she had this huge kirgizur, which is a series of circular stones placed on top of her burial. And it was the largest grave at that site. And we found the first piece of gold for the region in the form of a gold earring. It's pretty powerful moment. You're like, wow, this is somebody that was really important. But it's more moving too that she had all those other things going for her in terms of being pregnant or just delivered children, and she had a wooden coffin that had lacquer on it and it was highly stylized and decorated. Getting a sense of that individual and how they were perceived by their society and culture.
I am Ken Angelic. I am the assistant curator of paleomammalogy in the Department of Geology at the Field Museum. So about 285 million years ago in areas in Texas and Oklahoma, we had essentially a bunch of mammal ancestors and other sorts of amphibians and reptiles and things living in sort of a coastal plain environment, so something like what Louisiana is like today. And researchers at the University of Chicago and also the Field Museum have a fairly long history going back to literally the beginning of the 20th century of doing field work in those areas. So we have one of the largest and kind of historically most important collections of specimens, reptiles, amphibians, and mammal relatives from Texas and Oklahoma in the Permian. Amongst that stuff, we have a couple of specimens that are just really well preserved, skulls and in some cases skeletons. In our collections, there's a few really well-preserved, very complete skulls. One is a Dimetrodon skull, probably one of the famous early mammal relatives or synapsids, so it's the sort of large sailback carnivore. So there's an example of it that's on display in Evolving Planet. So there's a really beautiful Dimetrodon skull that is in the sort of research collections that's very well preserved and sort of all in one piece. Something I pull out fairly frequently for like donor events and things because it's a really nice specimen to see. There's also a sort of comparably well-preserved specimen of an animal called Edaphosaurus, which is another early mammal relative, and another one that has a sort of sail on its back, like Dimetrodon. Although Edaphosaurus is a bit different in the sense that it's an herbivore, and it actually evolved its sail independently of Dimetrodon. So for some reason, these animals were apparently under selective pressure that caused them to independently evolve these very strange structures.
I'm Dr. Cory Morrow. I'm an assistant curator here in the Department of Zoology, and my specialty is ants, and I work in the Division of Insects. I think for me, my favorite specimen is probably not one, it's several. So in the kind of research that we all do, we're usually dealing with species. And the way that we determine a species is that a taxonomist goes in and describes that species. And when they're describing a species that's new to science, they designate something as a type specimen. And that means that that one specimen represents what they mean by it being a new species. And it gets a very special designation and is incredibly important for our understanding of what is the variation we expect to see within a species and what are the defining characters. So here at the Field Museum, of course, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of type specimens across the museum, but for me in particular, it's those ant-type specimens that get me really excited. Things that were described several years ago through several decades ago and represent that new description of a new species to science. Sort of coming across those in the collection and looking at them under a microscope is always just exciting. I mean, they're so morphologically or sort of structurally beautiful, and just getting to appreciate that beauty is for me an exciting part of being in a museum.
My name is Olivia Repp. I am a Rowe Family Curator of Evolutionary Biology, and I work on fossil reptiles, mostly marine reptiles from the Triassic, about 250 to 220 million years old. And I also work on history and philosophy of comparative biology. I think my favorite specimen is this Augustosaurus from Nevada, simply for the reason that it's the only really important fossil I found myself in my career. So I've had a lot of interesting and important fossils in my hands, but I found only one myself that's really important. Yeah, we did field work in Nevada and we found lots of ichthyosaurs, which other people take great interest in, but I don't so much. So yeah, apart from the many ichthyosaurs we found, we were prospecting for this group in particular, and in the process of prospecting for weeks and weeks, we found 10, 12 ichthyosaurs maybe or more, but only one of that group we were targeting, and never a second one again. It is the only second representative of a group of reptiles in a new world that is abundant in China and Europe and Middle East. It helps us not only understand the phylogeny of that group in new ways, but it creates serious biogeographical problems that we still haven't solved. It's just a mystery distribution, and we don't know, or I don't know, how the thing came there, or got there. Very interesting.
I'm Nicola Sharrett, and I am just finishing my doctoral work here at the Field Museum in anthropology. I'm an archaeologist. Just to go back to your question about an object, I just remembered it, and it was just a tiny piece of ceramic. It was just a little bit of pottery. But what was really fascinating about it was that it had, when somebody had been making it, it had their fingerprint impressed in it, in the slip or the kind of seal on the ceramic. And that just, every time I look at that piece of ceramic, it's fascinating because the ceramic itself is a tangible connection to the past, but then you can literally see the person who produced it. You can see their mark on it, and it's pure accident. They didn't do it on purpose, but you can see it there. And that's something that always gets me.
My name is Nina Sandlin, and I'm an associate here at the Field Museum, and I work on spiders, particularly teeny tiny spiders. There are lots of great specimens here. There are millions of them, and there's a story for each one. But my current favorite spider specimen is a little vial of something called Islandiana unicornis, which when I was slogging away trying to identify these almost microscopic animals, and I'm looking at one under the scope, and it has this blade-like, saber-like horn sticking out of the point of its head, and I go, I know what that is, because I'd seen it in the book so many times. Now that particular specimen that I had in my hand had been collected by a Field Museum researcher in 1953 from a gopher hole in Kankakee County. The species had only been described for the first time in 1965 and was only known from a cave in Texas. So what this tells us is there's this huge amount of material, of preserved specimens, animals and plants, in museums that when you put it all together, you see the web of life.